take a deep breath, and let's hear a story about Ruth, who discovers ancient secrets hidden within the walls of the museum where she works. The morning sun cast gentle rays through the grand windows of the Egyptian Museum, painting golden streaks across the polished marble floor. Ruth adjusted her namatag and smiled warmly at an elderly couple entering the hall, her soft voice welcoming them to a journey through time. Each morning for the past 5 years, she had occupied this same reception desk, surrounded by ancient treasures that whispered stories of a civilization long gone. Ruth's small desk was adorned with tiny replicas of Egyptian artifacts, a miniature sphinx that she often traced with her fingertips when deep in thought, and a small papyrus scroll containing her favorite hieroglyphics. The familiar scent of old stone and subtle preservation chemicals had become a comfort to her, a fragrance that marked the transition from the bustling modern world outside to the timeless realm within. From her position at the front desk, Ruth could glimpse into the main exhibition hall, where the colossal statue of Ramses II stood in silent majesty, its weathered surface catching the light in ways that seemed to bring the stone to life. She often found herself staring into those carved eyes during quiet moments, imagining the sights they would have beheld if they were truly the eyes of the great pharaoh himself. During lunch breaks, Ruth would slip away to the less frequented exhibits, finding solitary benches where she could unwrap her sandwich and close her eyes, letting the gentle hum of the climate control system blend with the distant footsteps of visitors. These quiet moments were when her imagination truly began to blossom, transporting her from the museum bench to the warm banks of the ancient Nile. The visitors never suspected that behind Ruth's professional smile and encyclopedic knowledge of the museum's layout lay a mind rich with vivid daydreams of ancient Egypt. She could recite opening hours and ticket prices flawlessly, while simultaneously walking mentally through the cool corridors of a temple in Luxor, the smooth stone beneath her imaginary feet a welcome relief from the desert heat. With each artifact that passed through the special exhibition intake, Ruth's mental library of ancient Egyptian life expanded, providing new settings and characters for her inner world. The careful notes of archaeologists and the detailed descriptions on placards fed her daydreams with historical accuracy that made her mental journeys feel increasingly authentic. Ruth's apartment, a small but cozy space 15 minutes from the museum, had gradually transformed to reflect her professional surroundings, with soft blues and golds dominating the color scheme. Her bookshelves overflowed with volumes on Egyptian history, art, and mythology, many dog-eared and marked with colorful adhesive tabs, signaling passages that had particularly captured her imagination. On her knitstand sat a dream journal where Ruth faithfully recorded her most vivid imaginings, her handwriting flowing across the pages like the ancient Nile itself. The journal had become a treasure of its own, filled with detailed accounts of conversations with queens and observations of daily life in a world separated from her own by thousands of years. The soothing sound of Ruth's wind chimes drifted through her open bedroom window each night, their gentle tinkling reminiscent of the sistrum instruments played in temples to honor the goddess Hathor. As she drifted to sleep beneath her ceiling painted with stars in the pattern of the Egyptian night sky, the boundary between reality and imagination grew delightfully blurred. Each weekend, Ruth would prepare traditional Egyptian dishes, filling her kitchen with the aromatic blend of cumin, coriander, and mint that might have seasoned the meals of ancient nobility. The process of grinding spices and kneading bread brought a meditative quality to her days off, connecting her hands to movements repeated throughout millennia. Ruth's closest friend, Amira, a curator with a specialty in textile preservation, often joined her for these culinary excursions into the past. Together they would laugh and speculate about the lives of those who had worn the garments now preserved behind glass, sharing theories over cups of honey-sweetened tea served in delicate painted cups. The museum director had noticed Ruth's extraordinary passion and had recently begun inviting her to preview new acquisitions before they were prepared for display. The trust placed in her careful handling of priceless artifacts filled Ruth with a warm sense of pride and further blurred the line between observer and participant in the continuing story of these ancient treasures. As seasons changed outside the museum's thick walls, Ruth remained a constant, greeting visitors with the same enthusiasm whether they were tourists seeking Instagram photos or scholars pursuing specific research. Yet beneath her professional demeanor flowed a river of imagination as eternal and life-giving as the Nile itself, carrying her through days both busy and quiet. On a particularly quiet Tuesday afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the museum's skylights, a special delivery arrived that would deepen Ruth's connection to her imaginary world. A small wooden box, intricately carved and sealed with wax, contained a collection of personal items believed to belong to a lady-in-waiting to Queen Nefertiti. Ruth watched with bated breath as the conservation team carefully opened the box, revealing a copper mirror, a delicate bone comb, and several clay pots that once held cosmetics. The objects, though simple by royal standards, carried an intimate connection to daily life that made Ruth's heart beat faster with excitement. That night, sleep came fitfully as Ruth's mind swirled with questions about the woman who had once gazed into that mirror, wondering what hopes and fears had occupied her thoughts. The gentle patter of continued rain against her window blended with imagined sounds of water carriers at their morning duties, their bare feet padding softly across sun-warmed stone. In her dreams, Ruth found herself transported to a chamber lit by oil lamps, where a young woman named Meritaten prepared her mistress for court, carefully applying kohl around the queen's almond-shaped eyes. The scent of lotus oil hung in the air, mingling with the distant aroma of bread baking in the palace kitchens below. When Ruth awoke, the sensory details of her dream remained so vivid that she immediately reached for her journal, recording every nuance before the morning light could chase them away. The weight of the dream remained with her as she prepared for work, her fingers moving with unusual grace as though they remembered applying cosmetics to royal skin. At the museum, Ruth found herself drawn repeatedly to the conservation lab during breaks, watching as each item from the wooden box was carefully cleaned and catalogued. The conservator, noticing her interest, invited Ruth to observe the process more closely, explaining the techniques used to preserve these fragile connections to the past. These items tell us more about real Egyptian life than any royal treasure, the conservator explained, gesturing to the simple objects with gloved hands. Ruth nodded, feeling a connection to the unnamed lady-in-waiting that seemed to transcend the thousands of years separating their lives. Over the following weeks, Ruth's imaginary adventures began to center around Meritaten, the lady-in-waiting she had named in her dream. In quiet moments between guiding visitors, her mind would slip easily into scenes of palace life, experiencing the rhythm of days structured around royal needs and ancient religious observances. With each new scenario she imagined, Ruth found herself considering the similarities between her own life and that of her imagined ancient counterpart. Both women served as facilitators, moving others through spaces of cultural significance, witnessing extraordinary things while remaining somewhat apart from them. The parallels brought Ruth unexpected comfort, a sense that her role, though humble in the grand narrative of the museum, was connected to something timeless. Her daydreams began to feel less like escape and more like communion with a kindred spirit across the vastness of history. One afternoon, a visiting Egyptologist gave a staff lecture about the social structure surrounding Egyptian royalty, describing the elevated status and education of those chosen to serve in the closest proximity to queens. Ruth listened intently, mentally adjusting details of her imaginary scenarios to align with this new information. The more she learned, the more Ruth came to appreciate the complex reality behind the glamorous images of ancient Egyptian royalty. Her daydreams expanded to include the political tensions, the religious responsibilities, and the very human concerns that would have occupied the minds of those who wore the double crown. When the museum announced a new exhibition focusing on the daily life of ancient Egyptian women, Ruth volunteered to help with the educational materials. Her suggestions, informed by both research and her vivid imagination, brought a human touch to the descriptions that particularly resonated with visitors. As Ruth worked on the project, she found herself experiencing moments of deep gratitude for the path that had led her to this place where her natural inclinations and professional life could so beautifully intertwine. The warmth of this realization stayed with her like the comforting heat of Egyptian sun on stone. The evening of the exhibition opening arrived, the museum transformed by subtle lighting that made the ancient artifacts seem to glow from within. Ruth, given the honor of greeting special guests, wore a simple dress in deep blue reminiscent of the lapis lazuli so valued in ancient Egypt. Among the invited scholars was Professor Mahmoud, an elderly gentleman whose groundbreaking work on the daily lives of ancient Egyptian court women had fundamentally changed understanding in the field. Ruth had read every paper he had published, his words having fueled many of her most detailed imaginings. When the professor approached the reception desk, Ruth welcomed him with professional courtesy that barely contained her excitement. To her surprise, he paused, looking at her with curious eyes before asking, "Have we met before? Something about you seems remarkably familiar." Ruth smiled and assured him that they had not, yet as she guided him to the exhibition hall, a strange sense of recognition hummed between them like a plucked harp string. The professor commented repeatedly on the authentic feeling of the exhibition layout, unaware that many elements had come from Ruth's suggestions. As they paused before the display containing the mirror and comb that had so captured Ruth's imagination, Professor Mahmoud shared his theory that these items had belonged to a woman named Merit Aten, a name so close to the one Ruth had imagined that she felt a shiver trace its way along her spine. Some artifacts carry more than just physical evidence of the past, the professor mused, his gaze distant. Sometimes I believe they retain echoes of their owners' spirits, impressions that sensitive minds might still perceive after all these centuries. Later, as the event wound down and the last visitors departed, Ruth found herself alone in the exhibition hall, standing before the display of the lady-in-waiting's possessions. The museum had grown quiet, the gentle hum of climate control systems the only sound accompanying her thoughts. In the subdued lighting, Ruth raised her hand toward the glass, not touching it, but allowing herself to feel whatever invisible connection had been building since the artifact's arrival. A profound sense of peace settled over her, as though a circle had been completed in some cosmic pattern too vast for her to fully comprehend. That night, Ruth's dreams were unusually clear, filled with details of ancient life so precise she could count the petals on lotus flowers floating in palace pools. Yet unlike previous dreams, she did not see through Meriditane's eyes, but rather sat beside her as a friend, sharing quiet conversation as they watched royal children play in garden courtyards. When morning came, Ruth awoke with a sensation of having been truly rested for the first time in years. The boundary between her imagination and her reality felt less like a division and more like a permeable membrane, each enriching the other in a harmonious exchange. In the weeks that followed, Ruth began writing down her imaginings, not just as personal journal entries, but as structured stories, capturing the sensory details and emotional nuances of ancient Egyptian life. The process brought her joy, each word flowing naturally as though transcribed rather than created. Professor Mahmoud, who had remained in touch after the exhibition opening, read her first completed story with great interest. "You write as though you've walked these palace corridors yourself," he told her, encouragement evident in his voice. These descriptions align remarkably with what archaeological evidence suggests. With the professor's guidance, Ruth began incorporating more historical research into her writing, her stories growing richer with authentic details while retaining the emotional core that made them come alive. Her desk at the museum became a junction point between scholarly visitors and those simply seeking connection with the past. Museum leadership took notice of the unique atmosphere Ruth created at the entrance to their institution, the way visitors left her desk already emotionally prepared to connect with what they would see. When a position opened in the education department, Ruth was offered a role developing programs that would bring ancient Egyptian daily life into vivid focus for students. In her new capacity, Ruth found herself surrounded by people who shared her passion for making history breathe. Her office walls soon displayed children's artwork, showing their impressions of ancient Egypt, their imaginative leaps bringing fresh perspective to her own mental journeys. Ruth's first educational program centered around a day in the life of a lady-in-waiting, allowing children to handle replicas of the mirror and comb that had first deepened her connection to the past. Watching young faces light up with the same wonder she had experienced brought Ruth a profound sense of fulfillment and purpose. On quiet evenings, Ruth still sat before her journal, but now her writing carried the confidence of someone who had found her true calling. The gentle scratch of her pen across paper blended with the soft purring of a cat she had adopted and named Bastet, after the Egyptian goddess of home and protection. As seasons continued their eternal cycle, Ruth no longer needed to escape into imagination, having built a life where past and present coexisted in harmonious balance. The golden sands of ancient Egypt had become a foundation rather than a distant shore, supporting a reality more fulfilling than she had ever dared to dream.